The Ardennes Forest, December 18th, 1944. The snow had not yet fallen, but the mist already blurred every line between life and death. Inside that pale fog, a German sniper lay pressed to the frozen earth, his Mauser rifle trained on a figure moving slowly through the wreckage. He had waited for hours, breathing through his teeth, finger resting lightly on the trigger, his heartbeat syncing with the ticking second hand of a broken pocket watch. Every detail in his scope magnified into terrifying clarity. The chaplain's wool coat, the small silver cross hanging from his neck, the way his lips moved silently. Then, through the hum of distant artillery, the sniper heard words. "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." It was a prayer carried on the wind, fragile and absurd amid gunfire. The sniper's brow twitched. He whispered to himself in German, "If I shoot, I'll hit a prayer." His finger trembled. He saw the chaplain kneeling beside the bodies of both Americans and Germans, closing their eyes one by one, snowflakes settling gently on their faces. That gesture, to bless friend and foe alike, tore through years of hardened belief. For the first time since Poland, since Crete, since Normandy, the sniper lowered his rifle. In that instant, the battlefield fell eerily quiet. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if history itself held its breath. Somewhere behind the lines, a radio cracked with the latest report. Operation Watch on the Rhine continues. 34,000 German troops engaged. Numbers, logistics, steel. Yet here, in a circle of mist barely 10 meters wide, something far larger than any army had shifted. The sniper exhaled slowly, his scope clouding with his own breath. He had spent 3 years believing salvation was earned through precision, through control, through taking lives before they took yours. But that single voice in the fog had undone it all. He whispered, "If there is a God, he just stopped me." The sentence left his mouth like a confession and dissolved into the cold. Unseen by him, the chaplain moved to another fallen man, whispering the same prayer, unaware that an unseen rifle had just chosen mercy over death. The sniper lay back, staring at the canopy above, branches black against the dawn. The smell of gunpowder lingered, mingled with pine sap and wet soil, the scent of both creation and decay. He pressed his palms together, not in prayer, but in surrender to something he could not name. The sound of distant engines grew louder, American Shermans crawling through the forest, and he knew his reprieve would not last. Still, for that one impossible minute, the war had stopped in his crosshairs. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. Now tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? The mortar fell without warning. 1 second of silence, then a roar that lifted the ground itself. The sniper, Obergefreiter Hans Keller, 2nd Fallschirmjäger Division, felt the world spin in white and red. The concussion threw him into a crater still smoking with steam, half filled with snow and blood. His ears rang with the sound of his own heartbeat, the rifle somewhere far above, useless. He tried to crawl, but his right leg didn't answer. A splinter of wood had lodged deep between his ribs, and with each breath came the metallic taste of earth and iron. When he opened his eyes again, he saw something glinting beside him. A broken silver cross, its chain tangled in the mud. He picked it up, at first thinking it was his own dog tag. Then he saw the engraving, J. Whitmore, U.S. Army Chaplain. Keller stared at it for a long moment, the man he had almost killed. The same man whose prayer had frozen his trigger finger minutes before. Far off, through the drifting snow, came faint voices in English. He pressed the cross to his chest and whispered, "So, that's what you wanted me to find." He had lost faith years ago when his brother died near Stalingrad, yet this small piece of metal, bent and blood-stained, felt heavier than all his medals combined. An hour later, Captain James Whitmore returned to the same clearing, searching for the wounded. He moved carefully, hands lifted above the fog, holding a Red Cross armband so enemy survivors would see. Near the crater, he saw a movement. A German uniform, slumped, half buried. He expected the man to reach for a weapon. Instead, Keller turned his face toward him and, through cracked lips, said, "I think this belongs to you." He opened his palm and revealed the broken cross. For a few seconds, the chaplain didn't speak. He only looked at the man, this enemy who had held death in his hands and chosen not to use it. The chaplain knelt, took the cross, and said softly, "Then perhaps it was never lost." He placed it around his neck again, the mud still clinging to it. That moment, quiet, unreal, suspended in the middle of a collapsing war, would stay with both men for decades. Soldiers were shouting somewhere nearby, calling for stretchers, for morphine, for the wounded. But for those few breaths, the world contained only two men and a symbol that neither army had ordered them to carry. As artillery resumed in the distance, Whitmore looked at Keller and said, "You're not safe here." The Germans smiled faintly. "Neither are you." They both knew the absurdity of that truth, but the chaplain had made his decision. He wrapped Keller's arm around his shoulder, lifted him slowly from the crater, and began the long crawl toward the edge of the woods. Behind them, the cross caught a shard of sunlight, a flash, brief as a heartbeat, before the mist swallowed it again. The forest floor had turned to liquid brown, a chaos of roots and half-frozen puddles. Captain Whitmore's boots sank with every step, his breath coming in sharp bursts. Keller hung across his shoulders, his weight shifting with each stumble. The American chaplain's ribs had been bruised from an earlier blast, yet he refused to set the German down. Every few meters, gunfire cracked from unseen ridges, echoing off the trees like thunder trapped between branches. "Leave me," Keller rasped, the words struggling through blood. "You're carrying your enemy." Whitmore adjusted his grip and kept moving. "Then I'll have fewer enemies to carry tomorrow." It was not bravado. It was conviction, one that cut through exhaustion sharper than pain. He could feel Keller's pulse fluttering against his back, irregular but alive. Around them, artillery bursts painted the fog orange. Shrapnel hissed through the air like angry bees. Twice, Whitmore dropped to his knees, shielding the German's body with his own. Each time, Keller thought, no one orders him to do this. At one point, they passed a burned-out Jeep still smoldering, its wheels half buried in the snow. A dead medic leaned against it, a morphine syringe frozen in his hand. Whitmore paused, closed the man's eyes, and whispered, "We'll finish your work." Then he pushed forward, every step dragging both bodies closer to the aid post miles away. Behind them, the forest echoed with the cries of the dying, voices in English, German, and sometimes both, indistinguishable in pain. The Ardennes that winter had become a place where geography itself had given up, where no side truly owned a single patch of ground for more than a few hours. As they reached the riverbank, the mud deepened. Whitmore slipped, falling hard onto his knees. Keller cried out in pain. The chaplain looked down at his trembling hands, his wedding ring, blackened by soot, gleaming faintly. He remembered his wife's last letter. "If you ever doubt, remember the faces you were sent to love, not the sides they fought for." He clenched his jaw, stood again, and lifted the German higher. By the time they reached the shattered remains of a bridge, Whitmore's breath came in ragged gasps. The chaplain's uniform was soaked, the Red Cross armband torn. Ahead, a faint lantern glowed, a field aid station run by the 326th Medical Company. Between them and that light lay open ground. Keller whispered, "If we move now, they'll shoot." Whitmore replied, "Then we pray while running." They went, one carrying, one carried, across the frozen mud. Bullets tore the air, snapping twigs inches from their heads. But somehow, by the time Whitmore stumbled into the doorway of the tent, they were both still breathing. The orderlies inside froze at the sight. An American chaplain holding a German sniper in his arms. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Whitmore whispered, "He's not the enemy anymore." When they reached the field hospital, the lantern light looked almost holy against the storm outside. Inside the tent, cots lined the floor. Americans with shrapnel wounds, men missing limbs, nurses moving between them with trembling hands and empty morphine bottles. The smell of iodine mixed with gunpowder, sweat, and fear. Captain Whitmore pushed through the flap, his uniform black with mud, still carrying the German over his shoulders. "Medic!" he shouted. "He's losing blood fast." The surgeon, a tired man in his 40s with a name tag reading Dr. Ernest Pike, looked up from a wounded sergeant whose leg was held together by a belt. He saw the gray field jacket, the eagle patch, the foreign face. Then his voice turned to steel. "We're full. Prioritize our own." Whitmore didn't flinch. He lowered Keller gently onto the ground, his knees buckling. "He's still a man. You save men here, don't you?" Dr. Pike wiped his hands on a blood-stained towel. "This isn't about mercy, Chaplain. It's about math. We have 28 of ours still breathing, 3 pints of plasma left, and 1 generator barely running. If I save him, 1 of ours dies without morphine." The tent fell silent except for the wind. Then Whitmore reached into his pocket and pulled out the broken silver cross. He set it on the surgical table and said, "He's under this now." For a long moment, no one spoke. The nurses exchanged glances. The surgeon sighed, eyes flicking to the symbol. "Then may God handle the paperwork," he muttered, and gestured to an empty cot. 2 orderlies lifted Keller. One of them, a black medic from Alabama named Private Leon Harris, whispered, "Never thought I'd see the day we fix up one of them." Whitmore replied softly, "Neither did he." Outside, the artillery had moved closer. The walls trembled with every shell. Yet inside that fragile canvas shelter, a new front line had appeared. Not between nations, but between the rules of war and the instincts of compassion. When the lights flickered, Keller opened his eyes briefly. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Because someone carried me once," the chaplain said. Dr. Pike stitched the wound in silence. The nurses handed bandages, the medics whispered prayers they didn't even believe in. The chaplain stayed beside Keller's bed long after the surgery ended, holding the cross that had traveled through fire and mud to return to its place. Outside, the snow began to fall, quiet, relentless, almost forgiving. By morning, 7 Americans had died, but so had something else. The invisible wall between us and them. And though no report would ever mention it, that night marked one of the few times in Bastogne where heaven's arithmetic outnumbered hell's. By midnight, the field hospital had turned into a world of whispers and rain. The generator coughed its last breath, leaving the tent in candlelight. Drops leaked through bullet holes in the canvas, tapping rhythmically on tin trays. Whitmore sat beside Keller's bed, his coat draped over the German's chest. The air smelled of wet wool and antiseptic. A nurse, young and trembling, brought him a mug of coffee gone cold hours ago. Outside, rain fell in sheets. Inside, the wounded murmured in dreams, some calling for mothers, some cursing unseen ghosts. Keller stirred, his eyelids fluttering open. He heard a soft voice singing, low, steady, almost unearthly. The chaplain was humming an old hymn, "Abide with me." His voice wavered on the high notes but did not stop. Keller whispered, "That song. We sang something like it in Dresden." His voice broke. He hummed along quietly, his accent thick, but his tone pure. For a few bars, English and German intertwined. "Bleib bei mir, Herr," the same plea in two languages. A nurse standing nearby froze, her eyes glistening. She whispered to another, "I don't know who's saving who anymore." That night, the war itself seemed to hesitate. The rain softened. The candles flickered against steel helmets stacked in a corner, turning each into a small glowing dome, silent witnesses to mercy. In another corner of the tent, two American privates argued under their breath. "We shouldn't waste supplies on them," one said. The other shook his head. "You saw the chaplain out there. I can't hate after that." Even Dr. Pike, the man of hard rules and math, sat outside smoking in the rain, staring at the cross still resting on his table. He muttered, "Maybe faith's just another kind of fever. Contagious if you stand too close." At dawn, the hymn faded. Keller drifted into shallow sleep. The chaplain wrote in his notebook, his field diary stained with blood and coffee, December 19th, 1944. Rain fell like forgiveness. We sang together, not victor, not captive, just voices surviving the dark. Hours later, Keller woke again, whispering, "Why did you come back for me?" Whitmore smiled faintly. "Because mercy doesn't pick sides." Outside, the wind carried the hymn's last notes over the camp, blending with the sound of rain on tin, engines rumbling far away, and the first ravens circling the forest. For a moment, it was impossible to tell where the prayer ended and the weather began. So tell me, if you were there, soaked to the bone, holding a man who once aimed to kill you, would you still sing, or would silence be easier to bear? By the third day, the shelling had moved east, and the wounded were loaded onto trucks, heading for the rear. The sky had cleared into a pale winter blue, brittle and bright. Keller could now sit up, his chest wrapped in gauze, his face hollow but calm. The chaplain moved among the patients, blessing each one before departure. He lingered by Keller's cot, not as a savior now, but as something closer to a friend. They spoke in fragments, trading words through the limits of vocabulary and exhaustion. Keller mentioned his hometown, Castle, once filled with music before the bombings. Whitmore told him about a small church in Kentucky that had been converted into a soup kitchen when the Depression hit. For a moment, they were just two men trading small memories in a world that had forgotten the sound of small things. Before Keller was transferred, Whitmore placed a small envelope in his hands. Inside was the bullet they had removed from his shoulder, polished clean. "You carried this long enough," Whitmore said. "Now let it remind you what not to aim at." Keller stared at it for a long time. That night, he wrote a letter from the hospital in Liège. "You carried me like Christ carried his cross. I will carry your kindness until I die." Weeks later, the letter reached Whitmore through field mail, dirt-smudged but intact. The chaplain read it under candlelight, folded it carefully, and placed it between the pages of his small pocket Bible. He never replied with words, only sent back the same bullet, wrapped in a note that said, "You already answered." Years would pass before either of them could explain what that exchange meant. Keller kept the bullet until his final days. It lay on his desk beside a family photograph and a wooden crucifix carved from Ardennes pine. He once told a visiting pastor, "This bullet was supposed to end me. Instead, it became my proof of grace." In 1945, when the German camps opened and the prisoners were repatriated, Keller walked with a limp, but with a new posture, shoulders lowered, gaze softened. He volunteered to translate for the Red Cross, saying he owed his English to a man who refused to hate. History books never mention them by name, but their quiet letters still exist in a museum archive in Bastogne. The handwriting uneven, the paper yellowed. They are not stories of victory, but of release. And you, if someone who once hurt you reached out with trembling hands, would you answer with forgiveness, or would you return silence? Which weighs more, the bullet or the letter? Winter surrendered slowly in the Ardennes. By spring 1945, the front lines had rolled east, and silence returned to the forest where the snow once glowed red. The war ended months later, but the echo of that single act, one man carrying his enemy, refused to fade. 13 years passed. It was 1958 when a car stopped at a clearing near Bastogne. Captain Whitmore, older now, his hair touched by silver, stepped out, holding the same cross that had been lost and found in that battlefield crater. The forest looked gentler, but still spoke in whispers. Birds sang where artillery once thundered. He followed an unmarked trail and came upon something unexpected. A small wooden chapel built from pine and old ammunition crates, its walls covered with carvings. He entered quietly. The interior smelled of resin and candle wax. On the altar, a simple plaque read, "Here one enemy carried another. We learned what peace weighs." Beneath it, a small inscription in German, "Danke, James Whitmore." The chaplain's breath caught. He ran his fingers over the carved words, tracing each letter as if reading a prayer written by time itself. The chapel had been built by former German soldiers who returned after the war, men who once fought in the same Ardennes. Among the relics they left behind was a photograph of a younger Keller standing beside a half-built structure, smiling faintly, holding a hammer instead of a rifle. Whitmore knelt, placed the weathered cross upon the altar, and whispered, "It was never heavy." Outside, a soft rain began to fall, the same rhythm as the one that had once filled the field hospital tent. He stayed there until the candles burned low, remembering the faces of men who had cursed him, bled beside him, sung with him. He realized that wars are not measured only in battles lost or won, but in the weight of mercy carried through mud and fire. When he stepped out into the forest again, the mist had returned, curling between the trees like memory itself. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang. He turned toward the sound, smiled faintly, and walked into the fog. If you've watched this far, you already know this story isn't just about soldiers, it's about every one of us. When anger feels easier than empathy, remember the man who carried his enemy and the prayer that stopped a bullet. The Ardennes forest still stands, quiet, scarred, alive. Visitors who stumble upon that small chapel often describe an eerie calm, as if the air itself remembers. They rarely know the story behind it. Yet the cross on the altar, the carvings in 2 languages, and the faded photo of a young German and an American chaplain tell what history books forget: that redemption often hides in the mud between battles. Whitmore would later write in his final sermon, "Faith is not what we preach at peace, it's what we carry through fire." Keller, for his part, spent his last years rebuilding homes destroyed by bombs, saying each brick laid was one less shot fired. Neither man sought glory, and perhaps that's why their story endures. The war had tried to divide everything: faith, race, language, mercy. Yet these 2 men proved that the hardest front to conquer is within the human heart. Their paths crossed for only a few days, but those days changed the way they saw the world, and perhaps how we should see it too. The forest breathes. The hymn lingers. Somewhere, mercy still weighs heavy, and that is how peace survives.